Hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Dr. Matthew Wielicki. He's a sort of a climate scientist at the University of Alabama, and I think we're going to dig into a little bit of the topic of climate change and also about his controversial history in the last week or so. So, Professor Wielicki, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to make one quick correction. I'm an earth scientist, and the reason that I talk a lot about climate is that I wasn't in doing research in the climate field or for example, for oil and gas. And so I felt like I could take an objective look at that. So I wouldn't call myself a climate scientist. I'm an isotope geochemist. I'm an earth scientist.
Okay, but let's start there then. What is a climate scientist? Because that's sort of part of the story. You're not allowed to speak unless you're part of the tribe.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because you didn't hear about climate scientists for very long. This is a relatively new field. The way I would think of a climate scientist is that that's an atmospheric physicist because they're talking about, how the atmosphere currently works and, the physics behind that. But when we think about climate, the way we understand climate is we look in the past. And so a climate scientist is a geologist most of the time, because the way we understand climate and how it's changed is by looking in the geologic record and, using things like isotopic ratios to have proxies so that we understand what's happened in the past. So, I say all climate scientists are earth scientists. But yeah, you're right that if I try to speak about any of this, even though I'm an isotope geochemist, we use the same techniques, instruments, statistics, everything. I get told that I'm not allowed to talk about this field because I'm not a climate scientist per se. I find it very strange. If you want to have a consensus, though, it's easy to kick everybody else out and just have your little group. So maybe that's convenient for them. But the truth is, I don't really know what a climate scientist is. I think I know what an atmospheric physicist is, and I know what an earth scientist is. I think climate science falls somewhere in between.
Okay, and I mean, you've been quite active on Twitter in this debate recently, and I suppose you take what is broadly called a realist view of the whole climate science stuff. So, will you maybe sort of give us a Reader's Digest view of how you see the global warming debate and the climate change debate?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I see that there is no debate. And so if you try to open a discussion and have a line of discussion, you're called a heretic. You're told you're not a climate scientist. You're told that there's a consensus already. The science is settled. And so to have this type of debate seems very troublesome, or to try to even have a debate is very, very difficult. And the way I view climate is I look at the empirical data of what is happening today. And I like to look at a couple metrics, because what you hear is people use the word climate emergency or climate crisis. And to me, that has to have a metric. As an isotope geochemist, I'm very numeric. So I have an analytical mind. So I like to think about it and what are the metrics we can use to figure out whether we're really in an emergency or a crisis. I like to use things like, I don't know, for example, loss of life from natural disasters, way down. Cost of natural disasters as normalized to GDP, not really much change. The number of extreme weather events as recorded by the emergency database system, not really any change. So it's hard for me to accept that this is a crisis or an emergency when I don't see any metric that is telling me that. I see a lot of models that suggest catastrophes in the future. However, models are not science because it's unfalsifiable. If I can't test it and I don't have a time machine to go in the future to figure out if the model's correct, then that's not science to me because it's unfalsifiable. And a hypothesis in science, in the scientific method, has to be falsifiable. I have to test it. So I'm very much focused on empirical evidence that I can see in the geologic record, and I don't focus nearly as much on catastrophic models.
Okay, that's fair, but I want to sort of get to some of the specifics of those metrics. So, I mean, extreme weathers. I know it's contentious. As I understand, hurricanes is down, tropical storms are down, things of that sort, or at least they're stagnating.
That's
Some
right. I
coasts.
wouldn't say statistically, I don't think you could say they're increasing or decreasing
Mm.
because it's a relatively flat line. Oh,
Sorry, but then things like heat waves, for example, it's difficult for me to make sense of it. Some people say the 1930s have had more heat waves. Others say that the heat waves might, not be as severe as the 1930s, but they're getting worse in intensity. So there seems to be some nuance there. I mean, I don't know what you
I
make of that.
agree. I agree. And I think that, if the planet is warming, then I think that might just be something we're going to have to accept, that as the planet warms slightly, that you may have these spells of higher temperatures. I do think that, at least for the United States record, the 30s seem to have set a lot of the records. If you look at, just like state records of highest temperature or city records, it's remarkable how many are in the 30s. And we know that the Dust Bowl and the drought and things like that, there was a time period in that time where there was heat, there was a lot of dry, and that's cultural practices obviously came into play, that we were to stand, and things obviously came into play. But it seems to me that if there's one thing that a warming planet could actually be, there could be an issue with, heat waves would probably be the one. But the planet's going to do one of two things. It's either going to warm or it's going to cool. We don't have a stable climate. And with either warming or cooling, there's probably going to be some negative things that we're going to have to deal with. I accept that, changing climates are a challenge. But if this is going to be the biggest one, I still wouldn't consider that a catastrophe or an emergency. But I agree that if there's one metric that maybe that I'm seeing a slight increase in, even though it's hard for the U.S. data, it would be possibly heat waves. There was a big one in Russia and Europe in the last decade or so, and it's tragic. There are thousands of people lose their life. And that's very unfortunate. But I think humans are pretty ingenuitive, and technology, I think, can help us deal with future heat waves pretty well.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I mean, I'm just sort of I have to acknowledge there is. I mean, as somebody who's sort of taken a side as well, which is more lines of thinking, I have to acknowledge there is some people saying that. I sort of want to get to another one, which I find very contentious, and I still can't get a clear answer on it. Is the temperature record. Now, you're at the University of Alabama. I know Dr. Roy Spencer there has got this graph that shows the lower troposphere doesn't heat as much. As far as I know, there's two other satellites that seems to be showing a little bit more warming than he does, so I have to take that into account. I look at the surface temperature record, which is a different record that shows more warming. What do you make of those numbers?
Yeah, it's difficult. So just one quick correction. So Dr. Roy Spencer and Dr. John Christie, who are some of the leading folks that developed the way that we can measure global surface temperatures and global atmospheric temperatures with satellites. They're kind of in this climate realist group, and they get shunned all the time, but they're actually at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. I'm at the University of Alabama, the flagship, which is in Tuscaloosa, but I'm going to go see John Christie next week to have a nice long talk. He's the Alabama State climatologist. And when I have some conversations with them, or sometimes I see somebody like Dr. Richard Lindzen talk about this, it's difficult to distill a planet that has a huge amount of variability in daily temperatures. Every day there's a record low being set somewhere. Every day there's a record high being set somewhere. And to distill that down to an average, to me, is somewhat meaningless. And so, I have a hard time trying to figure out which of those data sets is right, which one is wrong. I think they both show warming. So it seems like the planet is warming. How much it's warming, how little it's warming, I don't know. But if somebody lives in an area that's not warming at all, and we could talk about these new models that are suggesting that there will be cooling in the northern hemisphere through 2050. Do they care that the average temperature on the planet is going up a little bit? Aren't they going to be much more concerned with their regional temperatures? And so it's hard for me to distill a planet that is so complex and a system that is so complex with so much internal variability to an average. So I just a ton of stock into really any of those. I think that I accept that they're warming. The answer is probably somewhere in between those two metrics that you talked about. The University of Alabama Huntsville satellites that do the lower troposphere, surface temperatures. To me, I don't know. Is there a huge difference between 1.5 and 2? Clearly, the WEF and the UN are convinced there is. I think that we're going to probably have to start looking more regionally if people are really going to care, because a half degree or a degree warming in the globe doesn't really translate to what's happening to them in their region and their crops. And, so I, I don't know. It seems to be the favorite number everybody throws around. I don't put a ton of stock into it, though.
Yeah, and I mean, the first of all point you raised is quite important. That what does it mean if the Earth's average temperature goes up? You're averaging places that have got a major extremes and major variability within themselves. So it's kind of meaningless in that sense. But yet we kind of see these numbers on the TV all the time. CO2 has gone up, temperature has gone up, and it just get your feeling on it. But it just would seem to me that it's propaganda that's being sold. It's got nothing to do with whether the Earth is warming or our emissions or anything of that sort.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think it's a good way to plan for the future. And so I heard a great analogy the other day that, if you're coaching a team that's going to play a basketball game in the next day, and you coach that team as they're going to play an average height of guys that are 5'7", and then you play and you get to the game and there's four guys that are 5'4" and one that's 7'2", you didn't plan to play that team correctly, right? So it's difficult to plan for the future when you're not really looking at the internal variability and the regional temperatures, and you're just doing this real big global average. So I know it seems to be the trick of the day. It's an anomaly. They would just show it in pure temperature, because if you do that, it makes it look very different. But obviously, there's a narrative that they're pushing, so they're going to pick the graph best for their story.
But what does it say? I mean, you use the word story now, and I think Dr. Richard Lindzen has said the same thing, where he said it's just about narratives. I mean, what does it say about a field, though, if scientists start speaking about narratives?
Yeah, well, so the problem is, though, if you read the working assessments for the IPCC, for example, or some of these manuscripts, and then you read the headlines, or you see Al Gore talking about oceans boiling at the World Economic Forum, if you go and look at the science, they're not saying that. They're choosing their words very carefully, and they're not really catastrophizing what's going to happen. But the media jumps on board, and these big governmental panels take this stuff and tweak it because they're really pushing policy. That's what they're trying to do, is change behavior. And the biggest problem to me is that the climate scientist or the earth scientist, which I'm a member of that community, they don't speak up. And, when you speak to them in the back channels or kind of over a beer, it's, yeah, we know they're blowing it out of proportion, but come on, it brings more attention. It brings more funds. I'm not going to go out and correct them. They're probably over exaggerating what I wrote in my manuscript. And so that's really where I blame the scientific community, is you're letting your science be bastardized by policymakers, bureaucrats, for not because they're interested in the truth and in the science, because they're pushing a policy agenda.
So it's just the excuse of the day to get the policy through in any way. So
Absolutely. And it's a good one, because look how popular it is. I ask my students all the time whether, if they think more people are dying today than 100 years ago from disasters. All of them say significantly more people are dying today than from before. And they're confident in their answer. And it's the exact opposite. So they've really convinced a lot of folks. So they've got a great, a PR machine that is really successful. So this is an uphill battle for folks like me and you.
But you're getting to something there, which I think is also plays a part here, which is innumeracy. I mean, I don't assume your students would be innumerate. I mean, I'm guessing that in your classes they should have at least some kind of technical mathematical background, but the general public struggles to deal with numbers. I mean, you say it's half a degree, or as far as we can tell, a degree over a century, 0.1, 0.2, maybe a decade. Okay, great. If I walk in and out my house, that's 2-degree difference. So, just on that basis, it doesn't seem to me to be a crisis. Yet we zoom into that degree in that graph, and then we show, all these hiatuses and ups and downs and things as if it is a scary graph. So what do you make of that?
This is the way that you can basically take data and manipulate it. And you're not falsifying numbers, right? It's just the way that you present the same data. You could change the way that the public perceives it. And they know that. And they're picking ways to show the data to the public that is going to fit exactly into this fear factor, right? They want to scare people because if you scare folks, you have a better chance of changing their behavior. And,
Mm.
I find it very disingenuous.
Yeah, but do you think the people? I always ask this to people when I speak of propaganda, and I guess global warming is a propaganda exercise. Do you think these people are dishonest deliberately, or do you think it's self-deception on their part?
That's a really tough question. All the climate scientists that I know and earth scientists that I know appear to me to be good people. Um, I think that there is a kind of a notion that don't rock the they're a little big self-preservation instinct where maybe you don't really agree with all this but you dare not speak up. And so but I try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes it's like a game of telephone where the story changes between so many people and it keeps getting bigger and more catastrophic and more catastrophic. And so, but I try to give folks the benefit of the doubt. I really think there's a lot of people that are convinced this is a major issue because the PR campaign has been really successful. And, I hope that they're not purposely trying to push a narrative that benefits them, but I can't say for sure.
Right, but I mean, it's always the case of propaganda that there's a combination of self-deception and dishonesty, and some people are useful idiots at sometimes. I mean, I'm not using it in an insulting way, just in a descriptive way. But what underpins this story, though, is the energy sector. One can't help but escape from the fact that control over carbon dioxide has got major policy implications for the energy sector, right? And I guess energy power is always translated into political power. I mean, it's no surprise that the Middle East had oil, and that's where there were wars on terror fought over there, and not necessarily in Africa. We also had terrorism, but not oil, right? So how do you sort of, I guess I'm going to ask you sort of a question in terms of geopolitics here, but like, how do you sort of, make sense of this issue through that lens?
That's a really tough question. I mean, this is where it moves away from science a lot, right? And it moves into this political sphere. And that's the most unfortunate part because the science takes a back seat basically to the policies and the politics. And it's very easy, especially for politicians who don't fully understand what they're looking at. And, they almost become useful idiots as well because they're not going in and digging up all these manuscripts and trying to understand all the nitty-gritty details. This is a really complex field. It's, climate's a coupled nonlinear chaotic system. To fully understand it, takes decades, right? These on this stuff and we still don't fully understand it. And so I hate that it's become so political, but it's exactly right. It's energy drives essentially wealth. And you can clearly see a correlation between emissions and GDP, for example, right? Access to cheap, reliable energy is really what drives a country from a third world into a developed country, into a first world country. And so it gets hijacked geopolitics. And I try to stay out of that. I try to just focus on the science, and try to convince folks that what some of these politicians are telling you isn't necessarily true. And maybe if people start accepting that, they'll stop electing the people that are telling them, what I think is untrue, is an untrue narrative.
Yeah, so you maintain the position that the science, in a certain sense, is irrelevant, right, to what the policies is at this stage. I mean, we've gone so far away that I mean, it's not clearly not about the environment. It's clearly not about the emissions anymore. It's just the politics of control, in a certain sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you see that especially with any sort of, dissenting views, right? So if you try to have a discussion or have a dissenting view, you get pushed out very quickly, you get ostracized very quickly. So they realize that they don't want to look at all the science. They're going to kind of use some of the science that fits their story, but they don't want to talk about all of these other published manuscripts that question these things. And one thing that I always get pushed back on is, well, go publish a paper, and first of all, I'm like, well, I'm not a climate scientist, so I don't publish in climate. But second of all, why? Because you guys would just ignore it like you ignored the other dozen papers that I showed you. And so if I just added another paper to that and made it a baker's dozen, you'll just ignore those papers. So, it's clear that they accept certain science that fits what their storyline is, and then they just reject other science that doesn't. And that to me hurts scientific integrity, right? Because there's going to be other challenges. And when those other challenges come up, if people don't trust science and don't trust scientists, especially in these big issues that politics will always get involved in, COVID is a good example, then you just, this is going to be a bigger challenge when the next thing that we have to overcome, right? And so we're kind of setting ourselves up for a future that to me is going to be more difficult if we can't objectively talk about science and try to remove politics out of it, and not and be very wary that when politicians use science, they're using it for a purpose, right? And so the ends don't always justify the means.
Isn't it though? I mean, you mentioned that you should try and keep science as objective as possible, but as you know, scientists have ambitions. Scientists are also human. They've got all the flaws that politicians have got. I mean, isn't it in a certain sense inevitable that these things would become politicized? Questions of this big nature.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's probably true. But if you understand that politicians have a goal, and that goal is usually either policy or things like real, then I think it'll be easier for folks to not get tricked or sucked to the propaganda machine, and they a little bit more objective when they view this. But I agree that it's going to be unavoidable that when we have big issues that we think are really global issues that we have to solve, that it's going to be impossible to keep that separate from politics. But if we could make sure that people understand that, just because they claim the science is on their side doesn't mean that you just take that and that's it. You go look objectively and you look at both sides. You understand the motivations for why they're saying that. But I agree, scientists are human. They have self-preservation instincts. They are ambitious, like you said. I mean, very ambitious, right? And there's going to be these issues, but the more we can show people that just because a politician is saying that the science is on their side doesn't mean you accept that. You go and objectively look and understand maybe what is the motivation for them to say that and not say something else. And then, I always tell my students, I'm not going to convince you or tell you one way or another on the climate issue. I'm going to show you a really broad, holistic view of what I think is the state of the climate. I'm going to tell you why I think that there is not a compelling evidence right now to call it a catastrophe or an emergency or a crisis. But I say, I'm going to let you make up your own mind. Keep an open mind, allow your mind to change. If there's some new evidence that comes out and we really see that the upper atmosphere is radiating heat back to space at these massively numbers, I'll change my mind too. So an open mind. I don't try to teach them what to think. I try to teach them how to think. And hopefully when these things come around, if more folks have that type of mentality when they go into it, then when I ask questions in the future that, are more people dying from natural disasters, they'll know the right answer as opposed to just, spitting out propaganda that they were told.
Mm. Well, your students, I mean, I would assume they're in their young, early 20s and stuff, and they, just come out of university, just coming to high school, or they're just going to leave for university. I mean, what type of student comes to university these days, and are they more on like the activist side, or are they actually in it for the curiosity of the science?
I think there's a whole large variability there. Here at the University of Alabama, these young people are very curious. They're very receptive to when I kind of give them a view of climate that maybe they haven't seen. Sometimes you just see jaws drop and be like, I was convinced that there was like 10 times more extreme weather events today than like 10 years ago. I'm like, I know, I know why you would feel that way. And so they were very receptive to that. But, when I was at UCLA doing my PhD, you could kind of see the other side there, where there was a lot of folks that, didn't really want to go investigate it, were more than happy to just kind of jump on the bandwagon and become, scientist activists and, just push the narrative. So I think there's a huge spectrum. Alabama's a little bit more conservative, and so maybe I don't see as much of that here that I might see at a little bit more of a, a blue state. But I think it's all over the place. But they're amazingly receptive to hear that the planet's not going to end in a decade.
Okay, well, that's good news, I suppose. I mean, I've also noticed just personally that this is a problem mainly of in North America and England. On the European continent, yeah, it's there. You'd find it in France, but it certainly wasn't as dogmatic as I found it there. And then when you go to the African continent, South Africa, this is not even an issue. It's not in our top 100 list of problems at the moment. So I sort of, what do you make of this localized, dogma, if you will?
Yeah, it's remarkable. I tell people all the time that it's a really privileged state to be in. To think that your biggest problem on the planet is 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 degrees of warming by 2100, when there's 2.1 billion people on the planet that don't have access to clean drinking water. What a privilege it is for you to go glue yourself to a painting in some museum because you're worried that you're the victim of future warming that we don't even know may happen or may not. When there are people struggling for basic needs, there are people struggling in food insecurity, right? Sanitation, clean water. And clearly that's why you don't see it in a lot of these other countries, is because, well, they have real problems. When it's a real privilege to think that this is the ultimate problem, and it's worthy for you to go out there and, be an activist. So I find it as a real telltale sign that when you succeed enough, you're always going to find something is wrong, and you're always going to find a problem that you're going to want to go after. Thank, developed countries have solved problems. These young people don't have to worry about food insecurity or clean water, so they worry about a possibility of a couple or a few degrees in 80 years.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's always been a case though throughout history that fanatics have used children to further their cause. And this is no better to me than what the communists did or what the apartheid regime did or what Nazis did. Any of these regimes, with variability between them, have always used children as foot soldiers, if you will, for their cause. And I don't know if you get your view on this, but don't you think eventually these kids will realize that they're being abused?
I hope so. If you would have asked me 20 years ago, even probably, yeah, probably 20 years ago, if there was a climate crisis or a climate emergency, I probably would have said yes. And as you get older and you start to see that a lot of catastrophic predictions don't really seem to work out, there's clearly challenges, and how human ingenuity does a really good job of solving a lot of these problems. You really start to think about, what was I out of my mind? Was I, was I being like, how could have I thought that? And then when I had kids, so I have 5 and 7-year-old boys. When I started to have kids, I started to think, what's the mental health aspect of this? Right? I didn't really think about that when I was young. I didn't think about that stuff. Becoming a father kind of makes you view the world a little different. And I started to think about, wow, what's the mental health impact on these young people that are being told they're going to lose their future? Their future is basically gone. There's no ambition, right? We're robbing them of ambition and hope. And then I started being like, wait a minute. I'm not seeing all of these catastrophes happening. Clearly, there's negative things that, there's things we have to worry about, sea level rise and heat waves that we talked about, but humans do a really good job of solving problems. And in order for us to do that, we need a good young generation that's motivated and ambitious and looks forward to their future. And I don't see why someone's going to want to be a good steward of the environment if they think the planet's going to be gone in a decade, right? Just throw your trash out the window.
And it's also that the solutions being proposed is not really addressing environmental issues. I mean, even if you take the assumption that CO2 is an issue, and I know some people will disagree with me and you on that, the solutions on the table does not seem to reduce emissions.
Not only that, the major solution on the table that could, which France is a great example of, right, going nuclear. And if you look at modern evolution of humans and society, what you see is that we have this steady from low density fuels to high density fuels, right? We start with things like wood, and I do a lot of work in Tibet, in doing geology of the evolution of the Himalaya. And I would see all these young Tibetan kids with all these dark boogers in their nose, this dark snot coming out of their nose. That's because they cook with yak dung. So, yak poop. And they dry it and they cook with it. And the smoke is terrible and it gets in their lungs and you could just see it. And then we progress to things like coal and the natural gas. And right, I see that progression continuing. And I think it's interesting and ironic to me that the same people who claim that CO2 is this existential threat for the environment and for the planet, they refuse to talk about expanding nuclear energy. And that's carbon free. It's high. It's the highest power density we have. It's reliable. It's not intermittent. These new small modular reactors are essentially meltdown proof. They talk about, oh, look at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. I'm like, that's 50, 60-year-old technology, people. Like, things have advanced. Look at what a car used to be 50 or 60 years ago, right? So things have advanced dramatically. And so I find it really ironic that not only is it that CO2 is an existential threat, but you can only solve it with what they are pushing, right? It's only their solutions that are acceptable and not any other solutions on the table.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it's clearly following the money. But, getting back to the nuclear issue, you know, you take even Chernobyl. I mean, the amount of people who died is something, I think it's like 33, it might be, it's within that order of magnitude
That's
anyways.
direct, right? That's the direct
Direct.
exposure.
And then the cancer, the thyroid cancer, I think is 3,000.
I saw 3
measured.
to 9.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But that is because they were actively looking for cancer. So there's clearly is overestimate the number, but fine, we can accept that. Okay. Out of a town of 200,000 people, it's clearly an acceptable risk, in the worst case disaster. Fukushima, I think one person thus far has been reimbursed by the Japanese government. And it's not even clear to me that they should have evacuated Fukushima. Maybe in the beginning, but they can probably repopulate some areas now because some people went back and they're not having cancer.
That's right.
So that whole argument is not being had at the moment because nuclear is proposed as the only thing that is more dirty than fossil fuels.
And ironically, I bring that up to people and they say, well, but they'll inflate some of the numbers, maybe 10,000 people or something. I'm saying, okay, I'll give you the highest number you want to throw out. Let's add a zero to it. I'll give you 100,000. If you look at reports today, they're claiming 5 million people die a year because of combustion pollutants that are coming out from the fossil fuel industry. So I'm like, okay, well, let's weigh the numbers here, right? We're talking about worst case scenario of a nuclear disaster, which we know modern reactors are much safer, compared to just yearly deaths that you guys claim are coming from combustion particles, which is very difficult to prove, and who knows if that number is accurate or not. If you want to just go by body count, nuclear is a really good solution, and it's carbon free.
Yeah, but I get the impression it's not about the emissions to any of them. It's not about that. It's about there's some, as I say, there seems to me there's some intellectual tradition that comes probably from, some people say Thomas Malthus, others say Ricardo, doesn't matter, who or Luddite tradition that is against the Industrial Revolution. Because, I mean, why is it 1.5 degrees above the Industrial Revolution? Who decided that 1850 was the ideal temperature of the planet, for example?
That's a great question. And if we look at just past temperatures, actually, it seems like humans did much better when the temperatures were a little bit warmer, times in like the medieval warming period and times like that. You could really see civilization really took advantage of those time periods. And it's a very arbitrary number somebody pulled out, and it's for some become the gold standard. If you try to discuss or show, for example, climate stripes, right? Everybody loves these climate stripes on Greta's book. That's from 1850 to present. Well, so I zoom out and I show climate stripes from 5 million years ago to present. And the picture looks dramatically different because it was significantly warmer for about the first 3 million years of that plot. And then you see us going into this cooling phase and then this interglacial and glacial cycle, which is kind of unique in the geologic record that we haven't really seen before. And so, it, climate is all about time scales, right? You can tell any story you really want by selecting the time scale that fits what story you want to tell. And so if you want to tell a story of, you know, catastrophic warming, well, grab it from 1850 and show it from then. If you want to show a story of relatively significant cooling, go back 5 million years, right? And so the time scale you pick changes the narrative dramatically. And so I don't know where 1850 became the gold standard, but on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old, the last 170 years isn't really a good representative sample.
Yeah, that's right. And that's it's a debate that is clouded with dishonesty. Just say it's about storytelling. It's not really about science at this stage. I want to sort of pivot the conversation to something else that happened at the University of Alabama, and I think it is related to the climate issue. And this is the rise of orthodoxy in academia. Unless you accept the holy grail of diversity, inclusion, was it DEI?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and climate. It sort of should be a
That's
C.
right.
There should be a C attached to that one. You're not part of the tribe, so what was your objective there to this whole story?
Yeah. So, I mean, at first I was getting some messages that said that I was getting fired by the university because my views on climate, and I just wanted to come out ahead of it and just explain myself. And the reason that I wasn't staying at the university was because I was essentially disgruntled, and I didn't the academic environment that I had dreamed about and watched my father go through and basically worked for since I was 12. It wasn't what I thought it was, and we had really made a big sacrifice by coming all the way across the country, all our family in California, and coming to Alabama. So that's a long ways away. And so, but I wanted to make that sacrifice. My wife was willing to make that sacrifice because this was my lifelong dream. And I just saw what I call the rise of illiberalism or rise of ideology, where there are these things that universities are doing, but I think the corporate world is doing this too, where everything is starting to be framed through this lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're making so many decisions through basically the amount of melanin in someone's skin rather than looking at merit, for example. And, at an academic institution, that's so opposite of how we operate. We give grades, we have GPAs, we take exams, we're constantly testing ourselves and providing some sort of numerical score to understand how well we've mastered the information. And now it seems like we're moving away from that. And this is all in the name of making a more inclusive and collaborative academic community, which is a noble cause. That sounds awesome. I totally support that. But it was having the exact opposite effect. We were alienating people. The non-minority students feel alienated because they think that they're not on the same playing field. Minority students get alienated because they feel that people look at them and don't think they had to work as hard to get to where they're at. Interestingly, in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math, the Asian community in limbo because they're not underrepresented in the STEM field in academia. They're in fact overrepresented, but they're still a minority in the United States. And so they're kind of in limbo. I call them white adjacent in this DEI stuff. in academia. So they're kind of in limbo. And so what you see is people start to self-isolate, they go back with their tribe, they don't mix as much. And if the goal, the original stated goal, was to breed a more inclusive and a collaborative university environment, this was having the exact opposite effect. But if you bring this stuff up, this is like one of these climates, because it's so ideologically based, that even trying to discuss it or say, hey, maybe we should look at the outcomes that we're having so we could figure out if this is having the outcome that we intended it to, because lots of good intended things have bad outcomes. I mean, that's just part of nature. That's why we're human and we make mistakes and we can't predict the future. And so even mentioning that we should start to think about this stuff and maybe investigate it and openly discuss it, wow, the backlash. I mean, um, University of Alabama faculty on Twitter called me racist and told me that I'm leaving and moving to Colorado because Alabama white enough for me. They linked me to anti-Semitic chalk writings that happened on campus. I never talked about anything like that. And so it proved to me at that moment that, okay, I was right. If I would have done this and I knew I wasn't leaving, that would have been dead, right? That would have been it. I mean, the university essentially has come to our faculty and told them not to buy, right? I haven't spoken to anybody. All this has come out. And so it really did prove to me that if I would have said this stuff in the past and I wasn't already leaving and happily parting ways, that could have really been career suicide. And that shows to all the other people, I better not say anything.
Yeah, it's having that chilling effect. And I mean, what my sense of it has been, I wrote a little bit about this, is that the United States is experiencing post-colonial ideology, similar to what we had in Africa after the Winds of Change speech. It ripped South African universities almost apart in the 1990s. It destroyed universities in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and in Mozambique. And it starts with this, where they, in an attempt to open the university out open for everyone, which is the initial goal, which you can say is an admirable goal, they end up focusing on racial metrics, and in the process of that, they create into not just divisions, but if you actually look at who benefits from the system at the end of the day, it's not the people it's intended to benefit from. It happens to be a minority among the privileged group, the people group you're trying to privilege. They tend to benefit off it. And then surprisingly, in the case of South Africa, it was that many white students actually benefited from it because they were put under a much stricter selection criteria. So, for example, to be a doctor and an engineer in South Africa, you need to be in the top 1% of the class, for example, where for the black students, they were rated at a different level. So first of all, there's the implicit racism that the black student cannot achieve it. And then the second one is you're actually forcing the more intelligent kids to rise to the top, and then they end up complaining at the outcome and saying the goals can't be met, and the cycle goes on and on and on. It's a self-destroying cycle at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think it has big cultural implications as well, because like you said, I find it fascinating a lot that it's a lot of times it's white people trying to speak for underrepresented folks. I find that meaning, idea that you're going to be the knight in shining armor that's going to save them because the amount of melanin in their skin means they're not capable of actually helping themselves. So you have to go and help them. That's crazy to me. And I think it has big cultural implications. And I think it has really long-term mental implications for a lot of these underrepresented students. I mentioned this before on an interview, but I'll just give you a story about my father. So he was a business professor and almost 3 decades or so, and he had one of his most memorable students, this African American gentleman who graduated and got an MBA and went off to become a really successful executive at a hospital. And the business school and the business community, they kind of stayed close because they're always interacting and internships and things like that. And he asked him a while later, how he felt about what at the time we were calling affirmative action. And the gentleman told him he hated it. My father was, why? And I'm an executive in a hospital. I've gotten all these accolades. I'm one of the top business leaders in the community. And I still feel that when I walk into a room, that all of my peers judge me that I didn't have to work as hard as they did to get to the place that I'm at. And this gentleman never benefited from affirmative. He was at the top of his class and things like that. And he's like, no matter how much I do, and no matter how many awards I get, and no matter how successful I am, I can't get out from under that umbrella. And so I made a post on Twitter that I found really fascinating. I said, I'd love to hear from the African American community how you guys feel. And I gave that story. And I was told that there was quite a few people that were talking to me that said that they used to apply to jobs and they used to put BAA after their degree, which meant for before affirmative action, because they wanted to clearly show their employer that they didn't have this benefit stuff. They earned this on an equal playing field. And I just think that culturally that has really negative implications. If the intended outcome is for more unity and more inclusivity and more collaboration, I don't think this is having the intended goal.
Well, it did not have the intention in neither South Africa nor Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was probably the worst example of what could occur because Mugabe, when was it, in the year 2000, said we must strike fear in the heart of the white man. He started killing the white farmers, right? And if you mention that, I think Donald Trump tweeted about that a few years ago. That was called racist. No, that was actually true, but that debate was closed down in Zimbabwe. Next door to Zimbabwe, we have a country called Botswana, where the white missionaries who initially founded the country were told to stay and become Botswanan. Next to that is Namibia, a country that also had segregation and apartheid, and it refused to have racial statistics collected. Namibia's today's racial relations is 10 times better than South Africa's. So they're not looking at the examples of countries with a comparable history to the United States, South Africa, all these countries, and saying which one of them worked. And there you've got 4 examples. 2 of them work because they didn't classify, and the other 2 seems to have problems because they do continue with classification. So we're not learning the lessons that should work.
Yeah, absolutely. But you can't talk about this stuff, right? You can't have this discussion. So you can't learn if you can't discuss. And that's the problem. And it's interesting to me that I was born in communist Poland in 1978, and we immigrated where I was very young. But it's a lot of the immigrant community see out to me that says, we've seen this road leads. We know what this type of ideological stuff brings us, and why don't the rest of you guys see it? I'm like, I know I see it because I hear it from my parents. My parents, right, are telling me about growing up in communist Poland. And I find it remarkable that we don't talk to the folks that have lived it, or we don't investigate the countries that are doing it now and their successes, right? And it's become this forbidden fruit that you can't talk about it. You just have to accept it. And so many folks just say, okay, I'll check the box, I'll jump through the hoops, and they don't think about the long-term implications. The other folks have lived outside of the United States and under different regimes understand. And so I find it really unique that it's the immigrant community that really comes to me a lot and says, thanks for speaking up, because we totally agree with you, and this is something that we came to the United States to get away from. And it's interesting that it's starting to breed and fester in the United States now.
Doesn't that speak, though, to a historical amnesia in the United States? I mean, a sense that nobody knows anything of other countries. I mean, the US is, for lack of a better word, an empire. They don't necessarily need to know something of other countries. And because of that, this type of ideology and doctrines, can find hold easily in universities because they're not prepared for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing how, again, it's amazing how privileged these folks that grow up and have never experienced another country or another political system or anything like that, how they could just think that this is the worst, right? And this, like, we're terrible, we're the worst country because of, every country has issues, and they'll pick whatever issue they think of. And I'm just always thinking, like, there are so many people on this planet that would change places with you in a second. In 1 second, they would change with you. And the fact you've never even gone to another country or traveled the world, or just opened your heart to talking to some folks from different countries, it's remarkable how skewed your view of the world is, because there's probably something like 7 billion people on the planet that would change places with you in a second.
Yeah, that's fair enough. What are what is your plans for the future? Let me ask you that.
Good question. I don't really know. We're moving to Colorado. My wife did her PhD in Boulder, so we've loved Colorado for a long time, and it's a real easy flight from California to Denver. They could leave in the morning and be having lunch with their grandkids, so we're excited. We're going to be close to family. I hope to continue to speak out about this stuff. I've you know I'm not really sure. Um, One thing that I'm pretty confident is that I'm going to continue to talk about this stuff, and I'm hoping that through podcasts like yours and through more engagement with folks, that this story can kind of get out there and I can keep telling it. And now I just have to figure out how I'm going to support my family. So I don't really know yet.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I hope you figure that out, and I mean you'll find something. I mean, it's always the case of people who quit their jobs and stuff. Within a few
Yeah, I'm
years,
confident.
few months, you'll definitely be fine.
We have a good
Um,
family support system, so we're confident we'll land on our feet.
in terms of sort of for the last few minutes, in terms of fighting, I guess for lack of a better word, dogma, which is what all of this is at the end of the day, is assertions that you cannot challenge. What advice do you give to people? I mean, especially people in academia who probably agrees with you or sort of agrees with you, but they know they can't speak out.
Yeah, I think that you know it, it's a fine line that you have to walk, but you have to think about the words you're using and the way that you are, especially in the earth science community, the way that you are teaching young people about the state of the planet. Think about the mental health effects that is having. It's okay to tell people that there's going to be challenges and there's going to be issues that we're going to have to deal with, and the climate will change. But to sell this, to tell it as this absolute catastrophe and this is the one existential threat on the planet, you have to consider what the mental health effects of that are. And it's a fine line, but I think if you can discuss this stuff in a holistic way and tell them that, even if you think that it's an emergency, you should show them the data that less people than ever are dying from natural disasters. The human condition is amazingly positive. I mean, think about the diseases we've cured. Think about how few people are now in abject poverty compared to just like decades ago. Child mortality. There's so many positives of the human condition. We're such an amazing species. We're ingenuitive. We use technology to solve problems. We have empathy, and those are all amazing things. So think about the way you're discussing this and the negative effects it could have on your students, and try to leave them with a positive message. It doesn't mean you have to tell them that everything's going to be perfect at the end of the day, because it's not, but at least let them understand that if you took a real holistic view of the human condition, it is dramatically more positive than it is negative. And, it's a fine line to walk, but if more people do it, then maybe, this won't be a topic that can't be discussed.
So, and you personally, are you hopeful that this is just a phase that, Americans or maybe the world for
Yeah.
that matter is going through?
Yeah. Yep. We've run out of problems.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, maybe maybe the world just needs, I don't know. Maybe there needs to be a real problem for change before people get over this one.
There will be. There's always going to be another challenge. I just hope that people appreciate science and scientists and the science method and objective evidence. Um, so hopefully they don't lose too much trust, because that's just going to make the next challenge that much more difficult.
Okay, well, Dr. Wielicki, thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you very much for what you're posting on Twitter. I find it very informative.
Thank you for having me.